says. Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm glad you could join us on this Sunday afternoon. My name is Matt Bodah. I'm a vice provost at the University of Rhode Island. I'm also secretary treasurer of the Greater Rhode Island chapter of the Labor and Employment Relations Association. Our panel today is called Capital and Labor After Trump. And we have three what I'm sure will be excellent presentations. Michael Hillard will be presenting a paper entitled, "Why is there so much talk of stakeholderism and so little of it?" which he co-wrote with actually a colleague of mine, Rick McIntyre at URI. Stephen Greenhouse will speak about why the white working class voted so strongly for Trump. And then Wilma Liebman will speak on the topic of business, labor, and divided or united government after Trump. You can see the full bios of our participants on the conference website. So I won't bother going into a whole lot of detail on the bios, but I will give some brief introductions here. So our first presenter, as I said, will be Michael Hillard. Michael is a professor of economics at the University of Southern Maine. He's a very prolific scholar in the areas of political economy, industrial relations, and labor history. His book, Shredding Paper, The Rise and Fall of Maine's Mighty Paper Industry, was published last year, 2020, by the ILR imprint of Cornell University Press. His co-author is Rick McIntyre. Rick is also a professor of economics, and he's at the University of Rhode Island. He's also a very prolific scholar in some of the same areas, political economy, industrial relations. Rick does also a lot of work in comparative and international industrial relations. And he's the author of the book, Our Workers' Rights, Human Rights, which was published a few years ago by University of Michigan Press. Unfortunately, Rick's unable to join us today. He had a bit of surgery this past week. We wish him well. I'm confident he's on the mend. Speaking after Michael will be, oh, by the way, Michael's paper is on the conference website. So if you want to download it and read it, by all means, you can go there and get it. Speaking after Michael will be Stephen Greenhouse. I'm sure he's well known to many of you on this in this session. Stephen was a reporter for the New York Times for over 3 decades, and the last 19 years or so of his time at the New York Times he spent on the labor beat. His most recent book is called Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor, and it was published by Alfred A. Knopf in, I think it was 2019, Stephen, was it, or 2018 or 2019? 2019. Of course, we all remember also The Big Squeeze, which was published back in 2008, which was one of Steve's first and a very, very interesting book.
Thank you.
Our final speaker will be Wilma Liebman. Wilma was a longtime member of the NLRB. As a matter of fact, I believe the 3rd longest serving in the history of the NLRB is I assume that record is still intact. Is John Fanning #1, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah, so he was my Rhode Island, he's also a Rhode Islander, so we have a little pride in John Fanning up here. But anyway, she served as chair of the NLRB, having been appointed by President Obama. She served as chair from 2009 to 2011. Since leaving the board, Wilma has served in advisory and consulting roles to many organizations, and as a visiting professor at several institutions, several prestigious institutions, most recently New York University School of Law. She's also the author of a number of publications in labor law and policy. Perhaps most significant, the capstone of her illustrious career will happen tomorrow when she gets the gavel of this organization and becomes president. It is tomorrow, correct? I think it is tomorrow. So best wishes with that.
I think it might be today. But I'm
is
not
it today? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought maybe there's a presidential address and then the passing of the gavel. But anyway, at the meeting, right? The general membership meeting today. I'm sorry. I should know this. Anyway, so today, okay, wonderful. Well, it's great to be here on inauguration day for Wilma. So I said she'll be our final speaker. So what I'm going to do is give our panelists 6 to 10 minutes or so. I'll try to get some warnings in the chat to them or something, or maybe just break in on them or something. and they'll give their presentations. And then when they're done, I'm going to ask the other panelists maybe if they have a comment or two about the previous panelist presentation. And then, as we go along, I'll do my best. If you want to put questions in the chat, do that. And then at the end, we'll do our best to address those questions that we see in the chat. And if there's any additional time, maybe we'll just ask people to unmute themselves and chime in. So with that, I think I've got all the introductory stuff out of the way. So Michael, do you want to take over and do your thing?
I do. Let me get my slideshow here. Back to the beginning. Okay. Very delighted to be here today. Very pleased and honored to be on a panel with people I admire very much, Stephen Greenhouse and President Liebman. And I thought last year that getting past the election and thinking optimistically from my own political point of view about what might happen after the election, I thought capital and labor after Trump should be the kind of big open-ended conversation we should be having in 2021. Let me talk about the paper that I'm doing with Rick McIntyre, who again won't be here, who's recovering from surgery. Is why is there so much talk of stakeholderism and so little of it? And let me just sort of premise this. This is going to be a talk about corporate governance. And I've learned in a variety of contexts that corporate governance, I think, is one of the most important forces in our political economy that most people don't know anything about. And if there's a bottom line message to this day, then I think people in LERA who pay attention to these issues do take it very seriously, but it should have a very high profile in policy and political discussions going forward. If I was to have put together an even longer title than the one we had, I might have titled it something like, "Are we on the verge of replacing a bad capitalism with a not so bad capitalism from the point of view of the US working class?" The impetus for us wanting to write a paper on this is the fact that there has been a sudden discussion in the last several years of returning to a form of running corporations that would look out not just for shareholders, but also for workers and other stakeholders. And in the business world, you hear a lot about this under the terms purpose-driven investment or investment according to principles of environmental and social governance. We noticed several years ago, all of a sudden there was a lot of talk of a return to stakeholderism. Most prominently, the Business Roundtable came out in 2019 and prominently reversed their 20-year position, over 20-year position of guiding the world, saying that shareholder value is the only purpose of a corporation, to a lofty manifesto called An Economy That Serves All Americans. This came on the heels of Larry Fink, who runs the biggest investment entity in the world. His annual letter to CEOs made a similar case in a letter titled The Sense of Purpose. We followed appreciatively but critically the work of Rebecca Henderson at the Harvard Business School, whose Reimagining Capitalism project is very much about all these topics. And she has a book with that title, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, that I would recommend to people. And especially then in 2018, Senator Warren, Senator Baldwin, and later Bernie Sanders too, put out major proposals to reform legally corporate governance in the United States with a stakeholder purpose. We do a brief history definition of corporate governance. It just simply is the structure of power within each firm that determines who allocates money within the firm and to what ends. Historically, there have been these dominant institutional archetypes written quite a bit about by people in LERA. Managerialism, a form of stakeholderism that emerged in the early to mid 20th century amongst larger, typically publicly traded manufacturing corporation, and last to the 1980s. The emergence of this new kind of short-term shareholder primacy corporate governance in the 1980s, and now a discussion of a return to stakeholderism. So the managerialism of the period before the 1980s was the kind of GM, IBM model of a company with powerful top managers, weak shareholders, and those powerful managers would practice a form of stakeholderism that accommodated internal labor markets, which is really crucial because that was going along with well-paid, sometimes unionized, some not, but well-paid employees, and what we might call a kind of long-termism in their sort of investment and management practices. in contrast to what we've had since. Shareholder primacy or shareholderism emerges. It was kindling in the 1970s with the rise of large institutional investors and a new ideology that made this case. First Milton Friedman in a famous New York Times letter in 1970, and then Michael Jensen in a co-authored article in 1976, and then a lot of stuff he did after that. So by the 1980s, you have institutional investors and various corporate raiders asserting that the shareholder is the only principal of the corporation, and used what can be described then and now as an active labor market for CEOs. If CEOs don't implement drastic changes in business models and practices, then they can be fired by these large institutional investors. What has been the impact of shareholderism in work over the last 40 years? It's been a major force driving the erosion of the quality of employment for most workers. We're following the work of some very well-known luminaries within LERA who've done the best work on this question of how has shareholderism affected work. And specifically, and again, Weil's book goes into the greatest depth of it, is Fisher Workplace from 2014. Leading to a destruction of internal labor markets, an attack on unionized labor relation structures, and has been a force behind both national and global explosion of low-wage labor. My book is a case study of the rise and fall of the Maine paper industry, which shows how financialization blew up labor relations in the 80s and 90s and gratuitously accelerated the decline of those companies. So what else is there to worry about with shareholderism? Well, out of the overall world of financial engineering, we now have this huge practice of stock buybacks, which could be reasonably called the looting of the American corporation. So in addition to financialization destroying employment structures and gratuitously running viable enterprises in the ground, we have most recently what economist William calls predatory value extraction. That's actually the name of a book of his from last year. If you're interested in knowing more about this subject, just Google Lazonic and read as much of his work as possible. He's really a key person in this field. And his work points out that there's a coalition of folks on Wall Street and in corporations, the insiders, enablers, and outsiders who drive stock buybacks. If you look at just the last 10 years before the Great Recession, we're talking about $5.3 trillion of S&P 500 profits going to stock buybacks. If you add the 3.8 trillion of dividend disbursements, that adds up to about $9 trillion, or 93% of the total profit of the 500 largest companies listed on the S&P was spent on enriching this insider coalition with nobody else benefiting from it. And the obvious point is that if you're spending all of your nation's profits, at least in this category, on stock buybacks, which don't do anything productive except enrich those at the top, you're eroding long-term competitiveness of these enterprises. And obviously, that's money that could be spent on better paid employment structures. So in sum, for other stakeholders under financialized corporate governance, workers lose. There's also research that shows that these stock buyback practices are not good for retirees, that is to say, long-term investors. And there's a substantial case made by Lazonic in his research that these practices do end the competitiveness of U.S. companies, and thus a future for their employees and the taxpayer too. And there's some key companies that they profile the stock buyback story and erosion of confidence in the last decade. So if there's a message that we wanted to get to a LERA audience for further discussion, it is that corporate governance reform should be considered along with things like the PRO Act as of equal or at least great significance in change the outcome for workers. In other words, I would like people who, even if you're just like approaching it as a citizen or as, part of the labor movement or whatever, that you should be really paying close attention to this stuff. We're very bullish on the proposals by Warren and Baldwin because they propose ending stock buybacks and providing for kind of a German co-determination model of, 1/3 to nearly half of the board directors' seats on large publicly traded corporations going to worker representatives. We believe that the Business Roundtable statement in particular should be taken with a grain of salt. They were very quick to rebuff an overture that Elizabeth Warren made to have them collaborate on getting her regulation or her legislative proposals passed. We think that the statement came as a response to the cumulative popular blowback against capitalism in the last 10 years. I think they were especially nervous at the time about Warren and Sanders riding high in the Democratic Party polls that year with their proposals to regulate corporate governance. And if you read the statements of all these folks, there's a very explicit fear of radical millennials. You know, they're talking about all those millennials who think that socialism is superior to capitalism, among other things, and it makes them nervous. So the conclusion that our paper, or the question that our paper asked in the conclusion to my presentation is, can we trust those at the top to voluntarily implement a wonderful new world of stakeholder capitalism? We're skeptical because there's plenty of evidence in the last several years that they aren't actually doing anything about their commitment to stakeholderism. Much, or at least if not most, of the purpose-driven corporate leadership focuses on environmental concerns, especially climate change. We're entirely skeptical, and we talked about the history of this topic around Walmart, which is widely discussed as a kind of great example, that non-union companies with low road models will take any of this seriously in terms of changing their practices towards workers. And so I'd finish with an analogy of the Great Depression. I think we're in one of those moments where the country has woken up and it's not particularly trusting big business. It didn't in the 1930s and didn't now. And we think that realistically it'll take, as it has in the past, countervailing power and robust regulations to bring about a reform of capitalism. And that is my talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Before we go on to Stephen's presentation, I just want to ask, does Stephen or Wilma, do you have any questions or comments that you want to present to Michael?
Go ahead, Steve.
I vote to wait after our presentations.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So then if that's the case, then Stephen, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks. Great to be part of this panel with Michael and Wilma and Matthew. Thanks for setting it up. So my topic is how to make sense of white industrial workers in the 2020 election. In other words, why did Donald Trump win over so many white working class voters? Here's one answer, and I quote, Trump galvanized millions of blue collar voters, many of whom live in communities that have never recovered from the tidal wave of factory closings in recent decades. Trump sensed what resonated with these voters. He promised to bring back jobs, revive manufacturing, and get tough on trade and immigration. His rhetoric was hot and visceral, and it connected. He told one rally in Indiana, we can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. Trump's tough talk went over big in Midwestern communities where auto plants, metal foundries, and machine shops had closed. True confession, I wrote that to explain Trump's success in the 2016 election with white working class voters, but much of that applied in 2020 as well. In 2016, Trump won whites without a college degree 66% to 29%, a 37 percentage point margin. In 2020, Trump won that group, whites without college degrees, 67% to 32%, a 35 point margin, 2 percentage points less. In contrast, Trump lost voters of color without a college degree in 2020, 26% for Trump, 72% for Biden. In 2020, as in 2016, there was a debate about why Trump won over so many blue collar whites. Was it economics? Was it race? Or was it a combination of the two? By 2020, more so than in 2016, it became clear that race played a significant role. Trump's race baiting and nods to racism were clear during his 4 years in office. As someone who covered labor for the New York Times for many years, as someone who covered industrial workers and many factory closings, I definitely felt that economics, that industrial workers upset about economic trends, played a big part in Trump winning over those workers. Many of them had soured on traditional Democrats. Many were angry about all those factory closings, and they often blamed the Democrats for not saving them because, hey, the Democrats are supposed to be the workers' best friends. Many workers never forgave Bill Clinton for getting the Senate to ratify NAFTA, even though the treaty was negotiated by George H.W. Bush. They were uneasy with Obama for pushing another free trade pact, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But many sociologists and political scientists said, Race played a bigger role than economics in why so many blue-collar whites backed Trump. These workers were feeling what sociologists call status threat, fear of losing their dominant position in American society. In their book, Identity Crisis, John Sides, Michael Tesler, and Lynn Vavreck wrote that racial attitudes shaped the way many blue-collar whites understood economic outcomes. Those three authors describe this as racialized economics, the belief that undeserving groups are getting ahead while your group is being left behind. They added that throughout American history, the groups considered undeserving have often been racial and ethnic minorities. They note that many blue-collar men also resented the increased role and power of women, and many of them embraced the macho Mr. Trump. Sides, Tesla, and Vavreck wrote that white voters' preference for Trump, quote, strongly related to concerns that minorities were taking jobs away from whites. They wrote that candidate Trump had milked this for all it's worth, dishonestly asserting that Clinton and Obama cared more about illegal immigrants than about American veterans. Exploiting this racialized economics, Trump claimed that immigrants are, quote, taking our jobs, yet taking our manufacturing jobs. Tom Edsall, the New York Times political analyst, discussed the status threat felt by many working class whites. By the 1970s, many white Americans who had taken their own centrality for granted felt that they were being shouldered aside, left to face alone the brunt of the long process of deindustrialization, a cluster of adverse economic trends, including the decline in manufacturing, the erosion of wages by foreign competition, and the implosion of trade unionism. These voters became the shock troops of the Reagan Revolution, and they now dominate Trump's Republican Party. Andrew Cherlin, a sociologist at Johns Hopkins, wrote, "These are people who have always had racial privilege, but have never had much else. Many feel passed over, ignored. Trump listened to them and spoke their language when few other politicians did." Declining mobility was another factor for these blue-collar workers. The economist Raj Chetty and other researchers showed that the percentage of children who make more than their parents has fallen from just over 90% for those born in 1940 to 50%, a huge drop for those born in 1984. The declines have been sharpest in the South and Midwest, and guess what? Those are the areas where Trump did best. As a result of globalization and automation, education has, of course, become all the more important for everyone, for workers. The college premium has increased, but many blue-collar whites have come to resent the educated elite and feel left behind and disrespected. Trump relentlessly wooed blue-collar whites by denouncing a coastal elite, everyone on this Zoom call, by denouncing a coastal elite that looks down on those in flyover country. The status threat many workers feel has also been fueled in part by the decline of class politics and the related decline of labor unions. Workers often feel more alone, more shunted aside as unions have grown weaker. One reason why Wisconsin is no longer reliably blue is that its unionization rate has plunged to 8% from 15% a dozen years ago. Unions help keep industrial workers in the Democratic column by urging them to focus on economic issues and not status issues, and certainly not focus on the cultural issues Republicans have seized on to win over workers, whether guns, abortion, cancel culture, or transgender rights. During his years as president, Trump showed his true racial colors far more than he did during the 2016 campaign. In an overt appeal to whites, when asked about changing the names of military installations honoring Confederate generals, a proposal that the armed forces supported, Trump replied, "Excuse me, I don't care what the military says. I'm supposed to make the decision. And what are you saying? We're going to name these military installations after Al Sharpton?" Hillary Clinton didn't seem to put up much of a fight to win industrial workers and several Midwestern states. During the 2016 campaign, she never even set foot in Wisconsin. She never visited a UAW hall in Michigan. She alienated many working class voters by calling many Trump supporters, their neighbors, a basket of deplorables. After the 2016 election, the pollster Stanley Greenberg wrote, The Democrats don't have a white working class problem. They have a working class problem, unquote, which progressives have been reluctant to address. Greenberg said that many blue collar voters felt that the Democrats too often champion trade agreements and immigrants' rights at the expense of blue collar Americans. Biden was very different from Hillary Clinton in that he engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Trump for blue collar support. Trump said Hillary looked down on working class voters. Biden talked repeatedly of the dignity of all workers, including, of course, blue collar workers. Trump spoke demagogically of bringing all the jobs back. Biden laid out specific plans on infrastructure and green energy to create millions of middle class jobs. Trump condemned free trade agreements, and Biden openly turned his back on the Clinton-Obama free trade mantra. Trump said zilch about raising workers' wages, while Biden embraced a $15 minimum wage. Trump savaged Richard Trumka and several other union leaders. Biden has promised to be the most pro-union president we've ever seen. Biden portrayed himself as coming from the working class. He was Scranton Joe, and Biden's efforts paid off. The percentage of white working class men voting Democratic increased from 23% in 2016 to 28% in 2020, while among white working class women, support for Democrats increased from 34% to 36%. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won union households by only 8%, the lowest margin for a Democrat since 1984, Reagan versus Mondale. Biden won union households by twice Hillary's margin, by 16%. A friend of mine, Joan Williams, a law professor at UC Hastings, wrote, "What did Biden do to win crucial support in the heartland? 3 things. He went there frequently, which Hillary Clinton did not. Biden talked about jobs with the message that we can revitalize our industrial base at the heart of the American middle class. Most importantly, Biden treated working class whites with respect, which had been sorely lacking when Clinton decried Trump supporters as deplorables, and Obama described Midwestern working class voters as bitter people clinging to guns and religion. Biden instead pointed out that Trump was a fake. I've dealt with guys like Donald Trump my whole life who would look down on us because we didn't have a lot of money or your parents didn't go to college. Guys who think they're better than you. To my mind, Biden is doing many smart things to win back white working class voters. He's seeking to reduce polarization and get the Republicans' fever to break through his attempts at bipartisanship. He's made a big pitch to win working class voters of all colors through stimulus checks, supplemental unemployment insurance, children's subsidies, infrastructure jobs, pushing for paid family leave. He's pushing to increase upward mobility for blue collar families, free community college, cancellation of a lot of student debt, making it easy to unionize. Biden is doing a lot of what I recommended in my book, full speed ahead with policies that lift all workers, white, black, and brown. I often quote a very smart insight from Fred Harris, a populist Democratic senator from Oklahoma in the 1960s and 70s. Yes, Oklahoma once sent progressive populists to the Senate. Fred Harris said, "The blue-collar worker will be progressive as long as it is not progress for everyone but himself." Unfortunately, many Democrats forgot the need to be very visibly helping blue-collar workers. But today's Democrats, whether Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Nancy Pelosi, or Chuck Schumer, get that it's important for government, for the Democrats to help blue-collar workers. Thank you very much. Happy to answer questions later.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. I guess we'll just go on to Wilma now to say the final words here. And then we'll, by the way, I want to remind everyone, you can put some questions in the chat. We'll get to those after Wilma is done. Wilma, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today and to engage in this discussion. And so the title of my remarks are Business, Labor, and the Divided or Undivided Government After Trump with a question mark. Not sure what we were thinking of at the time with that. But I'm going to try to approach that topic with 3 questions. One, to describe the harsh realities that have been exposed and exacerbated by last year's crises, focusing on 3 interrelated aspects: the imbalance between capital and labor, the war on government, and deep political divides. Second, to look at what is to be done. How do we handle these things? And three, what are the chances that these things will happen? What are the chances of some kind of transformation? I'm going to try to end on a hopeful note, but I have to say, in putting this together, I got myself pretty depressed. So starting with the harsh realities and looking first at the imbalance between capital and labor. Certainly the last year of the pandemic and the intersecting crises focused a lot of attention on the vulnerable and put into stark relief the desperation of many essential workers, particularly people working along the food chain, including logistics workers. What we saw was increasing poverty, food insecurity, especially for children, obviously loss of jobs, the lack of a social safety net, particularly paid sick leave, the financial security of most Americans, and the fact that many people are going to come through these crises even more financially insecure. And there was also attention paid to the millions of workers down the supply chain, many of them women, and increased scrutiny of global supply chain practices. The past year also laid bare the damaging impact of decades of the decline of organized labor and collective bargaining, the erosion of voice and bargaining power, stagnant wages, and the decline in the share of income going to labor, beginning in about 1980, but accelerating since 2000. And compounding that, of course, is that US managerial culture has been and remains uniquely aggressive in its anti-unionism, especially compared to other advanced capitalist countries. The US is clearly an outlier. And with the decline of unions and collective bargaining and the deregulatory tilt of the last 4 decades, what we have is no countervailing power, as Michael talked about. Wall Street and corporate power are unchecked. So that's one aspect of the imbalance between capital and labor. Another is the incredible wealth increase during the pandemic. As millions lost jobs, health, wealth, and even their lives, we saw what might be called democracy warping concentration of wealth. The wealth of US billionaires during this last year, since March 2020, increased by 55%. Since March 2020, Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, I believe, his wealth grew almost 60%, which certainly highlights the David versus Goliath aspect of the recent organizing campaign in Bessemer, Alabama. The largest wealth gains in the last year reflect ownership stakes in powerful companies that took advantage of the temporary monopoly and home isolation conditions created by the pandemic, such as online retail, restaurant and food apps, telemedicine, big pharma, video conferencing. All of these kind of companies reaped windfalls during the last year. And of course, executive compensation has soared. Not only has wealth grown, but there has been further consolidation of power in just a few major corporations. Again, especially in the tech sector over the last year. And certainly one aspect of this increasing power is the huge amounts of consumer data that these corporations can collect. And then the last thing I'd point to in terms of the imbalance between capital and labor is the increasing number of workplaces with asymmetries of power between workers and employers. Much of this is demonstrated by the use of sophisticated technologies that monitor algorithmic control and surveillance, but also the increasing knowledge of sexual and racial harassment in the workplace, and the increasing number of people who work on a take it or leave it basis. So the imbalance of capital and labor is the first kind of bucket of harsh realities. The second I'd point to is the fact that the nation has been at war over government for quite some time, especially the role of government in regulating business and the market. And the pandemic has clearly unmasked the high costs of government inaction. For some, and again, this is a long-standing war against government. For some, government's a social good, but for others, it is the enemy. Americans are deeply divided on this question. There are those who have never accepted the New Deal in the first place, or the era of expanded national power that the New Deal ushered in. Some people think that the regulatory state is unconstitutional as well as immoral. And given this deep divide, it has been increasingly difficult for, if not impossible, for government to play its role, especially at the federal level. So we know that government can have a big impact on workers, their lives and their livelihoods, whether through action or inaction. And the past year's intersecting crises have clearly unmasked for everyone to see the catastrophic consequences of decades of anti-government dogma and rhetoric and of government failure to act, whether in terms of stagnating wages, disappearing jobs, declining working power, and of course, accelerating inequality. And last, in terms of the harsh realities, I point to the deep political divides that exist here. I think that these profound divides amongst Americans have always been present, but periodically they become more worrisome. And they were intensified by the economic crisis of 2008, which created fiscal constraints and in turn led to partisan arguments against worker rights and finger pointing at public servants. Steve alluded to this. Remember the battles in Wisconsin and Ohio and elsewhere. So these fault lines, the divisions have never been healed since the economic crisis, and the pandemic and the Trump presidency clearly further inflamed these fault lines. Labor law, I just might add, is, I think, as the quintessential New Deal law, which has been controversial from the start. Unions and the law have never been fully accepted as legitimate. And certainly over the years, the promise of labor law and even the radical promise of labor law to redistribute income and power from capital labor, that never really erred. If it happened, it lasted for a few decades, but certainly is no longer the case. So in conclusion about the question of are we united or divided? Clearly united we are not. We are dangerously divided. I know I'm running short of time, but let me just quickly go through what I would see as on the agenda to deal with these issues. It's an ambitious one. I agree with Michael. Labor law reform is not the sole answer. We need to look much more broadly at corporate governance, at antitrust law, minimum wages, obviously progressive taxation. Certainly the stimulus and infrastructure bills that have been proposed would go a long way. But let me say that while restoration and revitalization of labor law and the institution of collective bargaining are certainly not a panacea or a sole cure for our economic woes, I think they would be a good start in the right direction. Because if we don't see a connection between the failures of labor law and the injustices and weaknesses that the pandemic exposed, then labor law and its ideas are certainly doomed to the margins. So what else might I look to do? Protect voting rights, construct a persuasive narrative to counter anti-government philosophy, increase citizen and worker activism, engage in a national discourse to finally reckon with our dark history, and I might even throw out the notion of social dialogue in the European sense. So let me conclude quickly. What are the chances that this will happen? I think as David Autor said yesterday, this is certainly a transformational moment. Hopefully this time we'll seize the moment, unlike the last lost opportunity during the economic crisis, when many predicted an opening for a New Deal, and instead what did we get was the Tea Party. So it remains to be seen whether this time is the moment when this can happen. On one view, America can't return to the pre-virus status quo. On another view, all our pre-existing views will just be confirmed, and the jury's out, which is going to happen this time. What is it going to take to make it happen this time? Do we have the political will? And if it doesn't happen now, when is it going to happen? How much more can we possibly endure? So we all know the risks of inaction. A lot of those have been spoken about today, but I think there are hopeful signs, including in stronger worker movement, increased worker activism. I think some of the anti-government dogma for the moment has died down. We certainly don't see agencies populated with people who are hostile to the mission of those agencies, like at the NLRB. And a lot of attention has been focused on the vulnerable with open debate about worker power and the future of work, including debate by some conservatives. So let me just say two more things quickly. Even the loss at Amazon, I think, was significant and a positive sign, because it did focus so much attention on the gross disparity of power between a company like Amazon and its workers. It focused attention on that company's compulsion to remain non-union and the weaknesses of a labor law that permit campaign tactics like Amazon persistently employed. So the final lesson, we can't take democracy for granted. As Henry Adams said in 1880, at its heart, democracy is a clash of interests. And democracy, as we have seen in both the workplace and in the state, has been an experiment in America from its birth, in a repeated cycle of promise, disappointment, and renewal. And a renewal that often comes in times of crises when the fault lines in society are laid bare. Maybe this time will be another chance for renewal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilma. Very, very much appreciated. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and so I think I'll put those out there. They're actually addressed to Stephen, but I think that, you know, after Stephen takes a shot at them, they're certainly, I think our other panelists can chime in as well on them. So one question.
Can I interrupt, Matthew, because you were going to give us a chance to
Oh,
respond.
I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'd like to do
Michael.
that very briefly. I've been practicing a very brief
Sure.
set of remarks. I won't chew into the rest of the time
Yeah.
so much. I just want to say about Steve's work. I love that. Always going to learn something from whatever Steve is digging in, and I really appreciate the sort of optimism about the focus and the impact of the focus of Biden's particular politics. It's just good to see that reinforced with some specific information. I would say that, you know, if we're going to be talking broadly about capital and labor after Trump and LERA, that we should also be concerned, and this was a focus of a panel that Steve and I had last year on a symposium, I mentioned in the chat there, of a book called No Longer Newsworthy by Christopher Martin. We just published a back and forth on that in the ILR review. And, you know, the question is, you know, who is the working class and what are their politics? Because that's at the center of what we're talking about here. So he's doing an excellent job there on the white blue collar working class, but we should also be always using the phrase black working class, you know, black working class voters, and to be paying attention, you know, equally to the political dynamics, which, you know, frankly, are probably why we're even having, you know, conversations about progressive policy this year, because of black voters who are largely working class. So, and then just on Wilma Liebman's point, I just think that we need to be very open and clear that, you know, coalitional politics that has a class tinge to it is kind of the heart of the matter at this point. And I think it's just really heartening in LERA to have a very sort of clear discussion that we got to bring people together who want to rein in big capital and with the full awareness of its political stance towards labor relations over its long history. So I'm just glad to hear all of the remarks President Liebman has on that. So I'll stop there.
I just want to respond 30 seconds to
Please do.
To Michael. So excellent presentation. I totally agree that, you know, I haven't seen much flesh on the bones of the business roundtables of corporate America's talked about stakeholderism. I keep waiting for real examples of any corporations going out of the way, bending over backwards to help stakeholders other than shareholders. And certainly during the pandemic, when so few major corporations gave hero pay, hazard pay to the workers. I mean, I just thought that was, you know, the $200,000 a year white collar workers are working at home safely. The $12 an hour, $10 an hour workers are going to to Trader Joe's or McDonald's, and they're risking their lives every day. And a lot of them were not getting hazard pay. And like, what better example is there that about the hypocrisy of the talk of stakeholderism? I'll stop there.
Yeah, I agree with what Steve just said, but a question, and I think Michael touched on this for Steve, is do we have a schism in the working class? is there almost even a warfare in the working class? Because much of the white working class certainly didn't vote in accord with capital versus labor. They didn't vote with labor in that, if you look at that imbalance. So is that something that you see, that you look at optimistically at the moment?
So, the book, What's the Matter with Kansas, really, when was that written? 15 years ago, 10 years ago, really explored this in detail. All these, working class voters in Kansas and other states are voting against their interests because Republicans have, like it or not, done an excellent job getting, generally, white blue collar workers to vote Republican by focusing on transgender rights or abortion or cancel culture or the coastal elite. And Trump really did a great job, milking their grievances. And, as I said, I'm not saying Biden is the greatest president of all time, but I think he has a great sense, and his advisors have a great sense about what needs to be done to woo these workers back. But there's a huge problem that, a lot of working class Americans watch Fox News and listen to, is it Spectrum? I forget the right wing.
I think that's it.
Yeah, the right wing network, and they're not getting the truth. So Biden could do all the best things in the world, and they're still getting a very, very jaundiced view of reality. So it's very hard. I was listening to a podcast with Ezra Klein interviewing Obama. And Obama said there's a real problem we face in trying to mend our democracy. That's millions and millions of Americans are getting a distorted view of reality from these right wing, fake news networks, and it's a real problem, and I'm not sure how we can fix that.
One of the things I really intended to mention was that just recently, within the last couple of weeks, a judge, Amy Jackson, had a case in front of her involving one of the January 6th people who came to the Capitol. This person actually never made it all the way to the Capitol because he had car trouble, but he did put a threat to shoot Nancy Pelosi on Twitter. And so he's been charged with crime, and she wouldn't let him out of jail because she said on a daily basis, we still have this barrage that the election was stolen. And she said, it's coming from news, it's coming from the president. And in fact, the next day, the president himself did continue that this was the biggest election fraud in history. So I don't know how we deal with these divisions when we still have this daily barrage.
Great, thank you. Let's go to a couple of the questions in the chat. I guess maybe everybody can see them. There's one from Victor for Stephen asking about, whether unions have failed to educate their members about issues relating to economic justice, immigration, and other issues, and could that be part of the reason why blue collar workers have voted the way they have? Stephen, do you want to address that at all?
I will try. I see Josh Idelson's on this Zoom. He probably knows more about this than I do. I think certain unions, and Victor, I appreciate the question. I think certain unions, the SEIU, the American Federation of Teachers, certainly the United Steelworkers, I think do a very good job educating their members. I think many other unions do not, and that's a problem. I was speaking to the president of a construction union, not the carpenters, but another union. And he was saying, what can I do? So many of our members support Trump. And I said, it wouldn't be the dumbest thing in the world if you put out a weekly newsletter kind of explaining how Trump's policies and economics were hurting workers. And he said, if I were to do that, it would be super divisive and would really foment tensions in the union. So clearly some union leaders don't want to, touch that third rail, and some do. I mean, Leo Gerard of the Steelworkers was great doing politics, 365 days a year. Randy Weingarten does a great job. The SAA does a very good job. But I agree, Victor, not enough unions are doing it. And Steve Rosenthal, the former political director of the AFL-CIO, stepped up with his own effort to educate former union members and current union members, kind of filling in the somewhat vacuum that some unions had left in the Middle West.
Can I just briefly add to that?
Please do.
Here in Maine, and I attended a panel of journalists and young union organizers yesterday. And millennials who are politically active have a lot of this right. In the state of Maine over the last 15 years, basically a millennial cohort took over both the state AFL-CIO and the central labor councils that we have around the state. And they've turned themselves into a movement organization that deals explicitly with race. And obviously that's a big issue because, you know, Trump carries rural Maine now, and that includes all those deindustrialized paper mill communities. And I see a whole generation of people working on it. So it's really quite heartening. I think it's one of the rays of hope that we should, you know, encourage, reinforce, and take advantage of.
The young taking over a state AFL-CIO sounds like a very good journalistic story for someone to do.
Why don't we move to, there's a question from Stephen Sylvia, also directed to Steve, but I also think anyone, others can chime in. You said Biden did everything right politically, but he still only got a minority of blue collar workers votes in 2020. Why? And why did more Asian and Latinx voters vote for Trump in 2020 than they had in 2016?
Yeah, I mean, I hoped I'd answer in my presentation. Maybe I fell short explaining why so many white blue collar voters support the Republicans, because they've been taught to resent the Democrats for supporting free trade. Even the Republicans were even greater free traders than the Democrats were. And they were taught about, you know, that the Democrats represent a coastal elite. The Democrats are increasingly a party of the well-educated and don't represent workers anymore. And, you know, Biden, you know, fought back against that and did better with the white working class than Hillary did, but there's still a way to go. And as I said, a lot, you know, far too many people are watching the BS pumped out every day by Fox News and Sinclair and the late Rush Limbaugh, and it ain't easy. So I didn't realize that the Asian American vote went up for Trump in 2020 compared to 2016. I'm shocked because, you know, Trump talked incessantly about the Kung flu and the China virus, and like some people say, you know, some people of color voted for Trump because the unemployment rate was so low right before the pandemic at 3.5%. So they gave Trump credit for the good economy, although I tend to agree with the many economists who say Trump inherited a very good economy from Obama, and, you know, thought he was born on third base. You know, and there've been lots of articles about how the Republicans did a great job on Spanish language radio and TV, telling former Cubans about how Democrats are radical left and communists and socialists, and they don't care about you, and how the Democrats were asleep at the wheel in responding to that.
Great. Question, I guess anyone on the panel really, there's talk about some parts of the Republican Party, in some parts of the Republican Party, about becoming the party of the working class. Is that simply laughable, or is there something to it? This comes to us from Adrian Eaton.
I think it's as truthful as Biden's assertions as Trump's assertions that he won the election.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a, trying to brand yourself as something doesn't make it true. I mean, I think that, the idea is that the only basis on which that works is, sort of white identity, racist politics, right? That's really all they're appealing to, is that you feel this way. The discussion of critical race theory is somehow or another, polluting the minds of our youth. I think is a really good object lesson. But I think that the problem is that the Democratic Party set itself up to appear AWOL to a lot of the working class over the last 20 plus years. And I really think that, Steve's comments are, there's a lot of work to do. There's a start under Biden. But I think the other thing is that, again, for younger folks, there's just a lot of organizing opportunities politically and in every way. I mean, their participation in Black Lives Matter last year's make them just as much likely to be willing to be engaged on labor issues. And the data on surveys show that's the case.
And Matt, let me just tell you. So a lot of Republicans say we're the party of the working class. They oppose a higher minimum wage. They want to get rid of the $300 unemployment supplement because it helps workers be a little choosier in what jobs they take. They're against the PRO Act. They're against a law to have paid family leave. I mean, it is, I hate to use the word like laughable. I mean, just let me say, it's very demagogic for Republicans to say they're the party of the working class. I mean, where's the beef? Give us examples. They supported this big tax cut bill that overwhelmingly favored the rich and corporations. So like, exactly how are they helping the working class aside from playing culture war to make a lot of members of the white working class happy?
And that's getting votes from the white working class. So I don't think they can claim to be the party of the working class in terms of their policies and their philosophy, but they're getting some votes.
Right. So I'm doing the best I can here to deal with all the visuals I got in front of me here. I think I saw it in the chat where somebody told me that Rose, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something? Rose Bott, did you want to say something?
Well, I put my question in the chat, and
Okay. Do you want to
I think
ask it?
well, I'll just say it that
Okay.
I really wonder what happened to the momentum of Occupy and the anti-corporate narrative. And my sense is that, Steve's analysis of, the status threat really is a very powerful explanation. But I would like to hear a little bit more on, what sucked the life out of that narrative, because, Bernie got tremendous support. We saw all that anger. So what has happened to that?
I just want to say that, Rose, I really think the generational part of that, if you're talking about folks under 40, I don't think that anti-corporate sentiment disappeared at all. I mean, in Portland, Maine here, I'm watching all these, former students of my modest state university with a handful of radical faculty. And we have a huge DSA local in Portland. We passed a referendum that temporarily during the pandemic raised the local minimum wage to $18 an hour, which I think currently is the highest in the country. And they vote plebiscites to, go for single payer healthcare. So I think generationally, folks under 40 are still very much embracing that, their willingness to say they prefer socialism over capitalism, which again is what Larry Fink and the Business Roundtable and Fortune Magazine, they're all talking about that. They're afraid of the left politics of the youth. They feel like they have to do some co-opting maybe to accommodate it. But I think that there's more, I'm more optimistic about that than you are, Rose.
It seems to me that something like Occupy got a lot of attention in terms of bringing the subject of inequality into public discourse, but it didn't have an organization. And so it wasn't sustainable because it wasn't like the labor movement itself. It didn't ally with the labor movement. Then came the Fight for 15, which again, in terms of the public narrative, did a lot to bring the public's attention to the notion of stagnant wages, and in fact led to minimum wage hikes all over the place, hasn't led to unionization of fast food workers. And so I think that yes, there's a lot of sentiment and support amongst younger workers. The activism that has been growing over the last 5-10 years is really quite remarkable, but it has not yet translated, I don't think, into something you would call a social movement or sustainable organization.
It would be great if what Michael was talking about in Maine, with all these young people getting involved in labor and taking over the labor movement, could spread to the 49 other states. That would be a very interesting phenomenon, and that would change the nation.
Well, the teacher strikes certainly that spread around the country, mostly through social media. That did happen. That was a remarkable series of events.
So we're just about to the end of our time here. I just want to, Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld had put a question or a comment in the chat about, how do we kind of restore how do we shift the tone of our public discourse and kind of get back to valuing some pluralistic perspectives in public discourse? And that's kind of a ponderous question. Could take another panel to discuss it, another hour or so, but maybe just in a few minutes left, do our panelists have any comments on that?
One way is, of course, to bar Donald Trump from Facebook and Twitter. Another is to try to restore the fairness doctrine, but I don't think this current Supreme Court would uphold that. It would probably say it violates the First Amendment, but again, with the Fox Newses and the Sinclairs and the Rush Limbaughs, it's really, really hard to bring civil discourse to everybody.
I guess
Michael or Wilma?
I guess I'd say that in light of the last year and all these intersecting crises, it's not probably realistic to expect a lot of tolerance and a lot of pluralistic acceptance. I think these crises and the debates about them need to play themselves out. And maybe when the dust settles, when people are back to work, when the pandemic is behind us, et cetera, maybe we can return to that kind of more civil discourse.
If I could just harp on the point I guess I've been making repeatedly here a little bit more. I really do think that the vast participation in the Black Lives Matter protests in the past year, which has brought a lot of young people into conversations about things like intersectionality and the actual critical race theory, not the mock straw person that right wingers have come up with, has really opened up a conversation about like saving our democracy, dealing with structural racism, and addressing what's going on with employment that disproportionately impacts people of color and women. I mean, I think those conversations are really alive right now. And I don't know how big of a moment it is, but I just feel like there's a lot more possibility for coalition. I mean, a state like Maine, we're finally getting to the point where the labor movement is A, talking about race, and B, trying to talk about environmental sustainability in a state where the labor unions and blue collar workers have never liked environmentalism, but now that's the conversation. So I think there's an opening here, and I think we should, sort of see the upside for that.
Michael, that's all to the good, but let's not forget that 70% of Republicans think that Biden was elected illegally, improperly. So those are the people. Those are the people we have to somehow reach to preserve our democracy, and that's there's a very good piece in the New York Times last Sunday about how all these conservatives kind of crap all over Black Lives Matter and just don't begin to see it the same way we do. It's really, it's a crisis for this country with the siloification of people's news sources. How do we get through to the people who are propagandized every day by Trump and by the right?
Okay.
Local organizing, yeah, where you bring people together who otherwise wouldn't be talking to each other, and it's all the old-fashioned stuff that we all know about.
Okay, wonderful. We're starting to run over a little bit here, so I'm going to have to kind of close this session out. I want just a couple of things before we go. Just one is, I want to thank all our panelists. I think they did a great job. It was a very entertaining and enlightening panel. I want to special thanks to Mike Hillard, who I believe I was asked if I would chair this at a certain point, but I think Mike was the person who really had the idea to put this panel together. So thank you, Michael, very much appreciated. And then I just want to correct my earlier error about Wilma becoming president tomorrow. It's today at the general membership meeting, which I think is in less than 15 minutes. So if you're a LERA member, please be sure to tune into the general membership meeting, and we can, among other things, see the passing of the gavel. So thanks, everyone. It was a very enjoyable session, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Michael.
Welcome.
Michael. Good luck, Wilma.